Hello, and welcome back to Benji's ASMR book reviews. It's been a few months since I've done one of these, but I have read a lot of books in the meantime, and I would love to talk about one tonight. I have a different mic setup that I'm working with tonight. I have two of my microphones here. I think this is the right one and this is the left one. I might have that backwards. But as usual, we're here in the office, which is not sound treated, and it has a very high ceiling, and there are a lot of motorcycles outside, and there are a lot of barking dogs outside. So this might not be the best ASMR experience, but we will do our best. The book I want to talk about tonight is Knight's Master by Tanith Lee. This is the first in her Flat Earth series, and surprisingly, this book was very difficult for me to track down. Usually tracking down a book is a fairly easy thing to do. I can go onto eBay or Thrift Books or AbeBooks, and it'll be right there. Finding one at an appropriate price, or a price that I can afford, is a different matter. But this book, for some reason, was very difficult to find. There were collections of Flat Earth books. They would have like 2 or 3 of the books in one, but I really wanted to get just the first book, Knight's Master, and it took me like a couple weeks to actually track one down, which has not happened before. So it really felt like this was some sort of magical, rare object that was eluding me, or that I had to put in more work to find. And I did eventually find it. What's pretty neat is that this was published in 1978. This is the first edition paperback, and it's in great condition. Wasn't too expensive. Was happy to get it. Now, I was first turned on to Tanith Lee when, I hate to bring up a upsetting topic on an ASMR channel, but when the whole cancellation of Neil Gaiman happened. I won't go into the details of all of that, but something that a lot of his fans were talking about is, okay, well, if I don't feel morally good about reading his work, what can I read that's similar? And Tanith Lee's name came up a lot. But I'm very happy to say it is beautiful. It is a beautifully written and surprisingly, I don't want to say dark, but it's erotic and it's upsetting, and what it is it's not so much a single narrative as a collection of short stories, but all of those short stories are very closely connected to each other. So where one story ends, it bleeds into another one. So something that will sort of to give you an example, there is a character in the first story who falls in love with a beautiful woman, this woman who is like born from a flower. After that character dies, somebody in the other story observes this woman crying, and then she cries 7 jewel-like tears, and those tears are used to put into a piece of jewelry. And then there's a whole story about somebody stealing the jewelry, and there's a trial of sorts, and then the jewelry gets taken into the mortal world, and then there's a whole story about the mortals who try to fight each other and kill each other to get this jewelry, and then that bleeds into a story of the jewel becoming the possession of this snake, who then becomes huge and evil and like eats everything and won't let anybody get near it. And then 100 years later, there's this wanderer who finds a snake and sings to it, and it dies peacefully. And then while the singer was singing to the snake, he gets a vision of who cried the tears that were in this jewel. And so then he wants to go down into the underworld to find this beautiful woman who shed these tears. And then that leads into a whole other story. So so it's not a single narrative, but it's all connected. It's all part of this universe, this world, this flat Earth that Tanith Lee creates, and they're all more or less bound to the central character, Lord Azarn, who is the Prince of Darkness, or Knight's Master. Or I should say, he's one of the Lords of Darkness. And I will say, I don't think this story's for everyone, because it's written in this very sort of, how would I put it? Not antiquated, but it's very much 1970s highfalutin fantasy speak, but it's beautifully done. And it does take, like, if you happen to get attached to any of the characters that are in the stories, you have to understand that eventually these characters are either going to die or they're just not going to be in the next story. Because, decades or 100 years or more than that will have passed by the time we get to the next story. The only constant is, again, this Prince of Demons. So if you don't like short stories, or you don't like, falling in love with a character and then having them cruelly ripped away from you, this is not for you. Sorry, I had to pause there. Somebody decided to take their muffler off their car. If you do like anthology stories, if you do like that sort of highfalutin prose style, this is gorgeous. It very much, it reads like a collection of fairy tales that you've never heard before. Like, if you are a fan of Grimm's fairy tales, or stories by Hans Christian Andersen, Italian fairy tales, Russian fairy tales, that kind of thing, this nails that tone. Like, Tanith Lee is a master. She is a wizard at this, pun intended. And I think that's what makes it really special, is because it really does, like, I cannot stress this enough. Some of the logic and the way the magic works, and the consequences of the actions, the way things unfold, it is pitch perfect to that. And so it's almost like you get, because most of the fairy tales we know, they come from hundreds of years ago, right? This feels very much like someone picking up the torch and telling fantasy tales with a bit more leeway in the content they can tell. Because, yes, obviously, because in ye old fairy tales, of course, we have, murders, we have poisoning, torture, implied assault, things like that. In Knight's Master, we have all of that as well. But we also have this very, like, the very first story involves a man being seduced by Azarn, the Lord of Darkness, which, I'm not an expert on these things, but for a book published in 1978, that seems like it would be pretty boundary pushing, pretty transgressive. And for me, that was a big eye-opener at the very beginning of this book, to just be like, look, this sounds like a fairy tale, but we're all adults here. So, and then there's also stuff that's just weird, like when one of the goblin-like creatures wants to steal something from his fellow goblins' home. The home is being guarded by a giant spider, so what does he do? He seduces the spider. And I don't mean like with some clever wordplay or something like that. I mean, he literally seduces and makes love to a giant spider. So, that's pretty wild. But yeah, no, I would go more into detail in this, but I think that, a lot of the fun of it is seeing how the stories weave into each other, and I've already spoiled a little bit by telling you how, that sort of progresses. So I won't go too much into it. What I will say is that there's definitely some stories that I liked more than others. The story that has to do with the snake and the blind man, I think, is my favorite, and it's, fairly short part of a much longer story. But it's just so beautiful, like the way that this snake goes from being this sort of loved, cherished object to becoming this horrible, devolved, but also gigantic monster. And then it's so, like, very much like, the ring in Lord of the Rings, this jewelry, twists it and turns it evil, and until finally, like, the one person who can't be afraid of this monster actually gives it peace. It's so well written, and it's so beautifully portrayed. And then, of course, there's a story of the king's daughter who is abandoned and then raised in a cave, and then something terrible happens to her, and she goes on a warpath, basically, and ends up tricking Azarn. And then, of course, at the very end of the story, Azarn has to make a choice about, how he will or won't save the flat Earth from being destroyed. There's another story where they talk about how when we're all born, each of us has a male side and a female side of our souls, and those are put together, and that's how you make a person. And, like, once that soul is put together, basically, it goes out into the world and somebody's born. And as part of his cruelty, Azarn separates this soul and sends them out into the world. So this one boy is born with just the masculine side of his soul, and, as you might imagine, is sort of just this aggressive monster. And then there's also a woman who's born with just the female side of her soul, and while she's very intelligent and very knowing, she's also listless and feels apart from other things. And as you might imagine, these two characters end up becoming, drawn to each other because they are each other's sides of their soul. But it takes quite a while for the story to actually get to that point. It tells you a lot about, how they exist and how their parents try to deal with them, and, how this woman is sort of inspires a lot of spookiness around her, and how this man is just, like, literally just a I don't remember what words I'm allowed to say on YouTube. He's not pleasant to be around, is the point. But as soon as he sort of gets the scent of this woman, it's not that he wants to sort of, like, claim her in this sort of, like, ravishing way. It's sort of like it's the first time, like, anything makes sense to him. And he goes to great lengths to be reunited with her, and Azarn goes to great lengths to keep him from reuniting with her. And it's great. This is epic in every sense of the word. Like, even the stories that are fairly small, there's such a beauty to the way that the prose is rendered that it's a joy to read. But you really gotta, me personally, really had to take my time with it, because it's in this anthology style, and because the prose is so rich, you really do sort of pick your way through it, like, story by story, until by the end I was sort of just blazing through it, because I'm sort of like, what's going to happen to the Prince of Darkness here, who's, like, make no mistake, is an asshole, but, he's our asshole by the end of it. I can hear dogs barking in the background at this point, so I don't know if I'm going to use this, but it's been a pleasure to be back here doing a book review, and I hope this has been soothing, and I highly recommend reading Knight's Master by Tanith Lee. For some extra ASMR goodness, I'll open some pages here. You hear that? It's nice. I know what you're thinking. Does this book smell great? It smells wonderful. Thanks for stopping by. This has been Benji's ASMR Book Reviews. Happy reading.